Imagine standing in a medieval village at dawn, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. It's sometime between 500 and 1500 CE, and you're outside a small cottage, its thatched roof sagging, its walls patched with mud and straw. Inside, a fire crackles, casting flickering shadows, and a cauldron simmers with something hearty, filling the air with a warm, earthy aroma. This isn't a scene from a fantasy epic with knights and lavish feasts. This is the real medieval world, where 90% of people lived, not in torchlit castles but in humble homes, toiling in fields, scraping by on whatever the land could offer. Welcome to the human wild, where today we're diving into the meals that kept ordinary medieval peasants alive. These weren't just dishes. They were survival strategies, woven into a life shaped by hunger, ingenuity, and the relentless rhythm of the seasons. When you think of medieval dining, your mind might conjure images of grand banquets, tables laden with roasted boar, exotic spices, and goblets brimming with wine. It's a romantic picture, one Hollywood loves to paint. But that was the world of the elite, the lucky few who could afford such luxury. For the vast majority, those peasants who made up nearly 90% of Europe's population, mealtime was about one thing: staying alive. These were folks who worked the land from sunrise to sunset, burning 2,000 to 3,000 calories a day, their lives tethered to the whims of the harvest. A bad season could mean starvation, and every meal was a calculated act of survival. Yet, in the face of this, they developed ways to feed themselves that were nothing short of brilliant. Without refrigeration, global trade, or nutritional science, they relied on resourcefulness, intimate knowledge of the land, and traditions passed down through generations to keep hunger at bay. Picture yourself as one of these peasants in a 13th century English village. Your day starts before the sun, hauling water from the well, tending to a cow if you're fortunate enough to own one, or heading to the fields to plow, sow, or reap. Your diet is heavy on carbohydrates, grains mostly because they're cheap, reliable, and can feed a family through lean times. Your meals are simple, even monotonous by our standards, but they're the result of centuries of hard-earned wisdom. Bread is your lifeline, a dense, dark loaf that's more than just food. It's survival itself. Pottage, a thick stew simmering in that cauldron, is your daily comfort. Meat, that's a rare treat, maybe appearing at a festival or when an animal's working days are done. Vegetables come from your garden or the wild, and fruit is a seasonal gift, savored when nature allows. Every bite you take reflects a world of constraints. Land owned by lords, taxes paid in grain or cheese, religious rules banning meat on certain days. But it also reflects ingenuity, a cuisine born of necessity but shaped by remarkable creativity. This story isn't just about food. It's about a way of life, how peasants connected to the land, how their social structures shaped what they ate, how their tools and techniques turned scarcity into sustenance. Every meal was tied to complex systems. Land tenure that dictated what you could grow, agricultural practices refined over generations, religious observances that shaped the calendar, and community bonds that made survival a shared effort. As we explore these humble meals, we'll uncover not just what was on their plates, but how they thrived in a world stacked against them. From the daily loaf to the foraged greens of the forest, from the simmering pottage to the carefully preserved winter stores, these foods were survival strategies as vital as the air they breathed. So, let's step into that smoky cottage, where the fire warms your hands and the cauldron promises nourishment, and discover what truly fed the people who built the medieval world. Bread was the cornerstone of their existence. If you peeked into any peasant home, you'd likely find a loaf or two, heavy and dark, sitting on a rough wooden table or tucked near the hearth to stay fresh. Archaeological digs across Europe, places like Warham Percy in Yorkshire or West Cotton in Northamptonshire, have unearthed bread ovens, grain storage pits, and milling equipment, all pointing to bread's unshakable importance. For the average peasant, bread wasn't just a side dish. It made up 70 to 80% of their daily calories. A working man might plow through 2 to 3 pounds of it a day, hard to imagine, right? But when you're laboring in the fields, swinging a scythe or pulling a plow, that dense, chewy loaf was your fuel. Wages were sometimes paid in loaves, and bread prices were tightly controlled to prevent riots. It wasn't just food. It was a social anchor, a symbol of life itself. This wasn't the soft, white bread you'd grab off a supermarket shelf. Peasant bread was made from rye or a mix of wheat and rye called maslin, ground coarsely with hand mills or at the Lord's water-powered mill, where you'd pay a fee for the privilege. The flour was rough, full of husk and sometimes tiny bits of stone from the millstone. Sounds gritty, but that coarseness was a hidden gift. Modern analysis shows medieval flour had more fiber, vitamins, and minerals than our refined stuff, giving peasants a nutritional edge they didn't even know they had. Baking was often a communal affair. You'd mix your dough at home, kneading it with calloused hands, then carry it to the Lord's oven, paying a fee called a banalite to bake it. In villages like Warren Percy, archaeologists have found these communal ovens, social hubs where gossip flowed as freely as the heat. Later, some peasants built small clay or stone ovens at home, a sign of growing independence. The bread was leavened with sourdough, a bit of fermented dough saved from the last batch. This natural process didn't just make the dough rise. It broke down compounds called phytates, making nutrients like iron and zinc easier for the body to absorb. The result was a flat, dense loaf with a thick crust that kept it fresh longer. But not all bread was equal. A 14th century guide, Le Ménagier de Paris, lists 3 types: fine white bread for nobles, medium quality for merchants, and coarse pain bis or black bread for peasants, made from minimally sifted rye or maslin. When times were tough and wheat or rye ran short, peasants stretched their flour with barley, oats, peas, beans, or even ground acorns and tree bark. Excavations at Hangleton in Sussex found bread remains with vetch and pea flour mixed in, a testament to their resourcefulness during famines. Bread wasn't just nourishment. It carried deep meaning. The Lord's Prayer's plea for our daily bread wasn't poetic fluff. It reflected real fear of hunger. Sharing bread built community, and breaking it together was almost sacred. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, chroniclers like Jean de Venette described desperate measures, bread made with tree bark or even clay. While some stories might stretch the truth, archaeological evidence confirms that in hard times, people turned to whatever they could grind into flour. Bread was survival, faith, and connection, all baked into one heavy loaf. Now, let's move closer to that fire, where the cauldron is simmering, filling the cottage with the scent of grains and herbs. That's pottage, the medieval peasant's everyday meal, a dish so central it defined the rhythm of the household. Imagine a thick, hearty stew, bubbling away, ready to feed a family whenever hunger called. This wasn't fine dining. It was survival in a bowl, a one-pot wonder that could stretch whatever you had into something filling. Archaeological digs at places like Warren Percy show cooking pots as the heart of peasant homes, often patched and worn from years of use. These pots were the workhorses of the kitchen, hanging over the fire on a chain or hook called a hanger, adjustable to keep the heat just right. Pottage was the ultimate flexible meal, grains like oats, barley, or rye boiled in water, maybe milk if you were lucky, until it thickened into a porridge-like consistency. For the poorest, it was just that, gruel, simple and plain. But when the season allowed, you'd toss in whatever was on hand: dried peas, a handful of onions, maybe some foraged nettles or a wilted cabbage leaf. The beauty of pottage was its adaptability. It was the medieval version of a fridge clean-out meal. Spring brought young greens like sorrel or nettles, bursting with vitamins after a long winter. Summer meant garden vegetables, leeks, carrots, a sprig of parsley or thyme. Autumn offered root vegetables and dried legumes, while winter relied on stored grains and preserved veggies. The pot simmered all day, and you'd dip in with a wooden spoon whenever hunger struck, adding fresh ingredients each evening to keep it going. Some pots, archaeologists say, might have bubbled for days, a perpetual stew that saved fuel and food. At West Cotton in Northamptonshire, residue analysis from these pots reveals a mix of barley, oats, wheat, peas, and leafy greens, proof that pottage was a nutritional catch-all. The long, slow cooking softened tough grains and legumes, making nutrients more accessible and neutralizing compounds that could block mineral absorption. This wasn't just cooking. It was a kind of alchemy, turning scraps into sustenance. On special days, maybe Christmas or a saint's day, a bit of bacon or a scrap of meat from a slaughtered animal might find its way into the pot, turning pottage into a celebration. Frumenty, a thicker porridge of cracked wheat and milk, could be sweetened with honey for festivals, making the ordinary feel extraordinary. Manorial records from the 13th century note these rare additions, showing how even a small piece of meat could transform a meal. But most days, pottage was about getting by, providing complex carbs for energy, some protein from legumes, and a way to eat vegetables that might otherwise be tough to swallow. The word pottage itself ties to the pot it was cooked in, and in stories like Esau trading his birthright for a mess of pottage, medieval listeners would have pictured this humble dish, making his desperation all the more real. Pottage was the heartbeat of the home, but not every region relied on the same grains. In the rugged hills of northern Europe, where wheat struggled, other grains took center stage. Let's leave the hearth and head to those windswept fields, where barley, oats, and millet thrived. These were the tough, resilient crops that kept peasants alive in harsh climates. Barley was the star in places like Scotland, Scandinavia, and the Alps, where archaeological digs show it dominating grain remains. Could grow in poor soil, handle high altitudes, and survive short seasons, making it a lifeline for those living on the edge. Barley wasn't great for bread. Its low gluten made for dense, flat loaves, but it shone in pottage, flatbreads, and bannocks, those unleavened rounds cooked on a griddle or bakestone. At Houndtor on Dartmoor, archaeologists found these bakestones in peasant homes, proof of barley's daily role. But barley's real superpower was in brewing. Even the poorest households set aside some grain to make ale, a mildly alcoholic drink that was safer than water and packed with calories and B vitamins. Manorial records from 14th century England suggest adults might drink a gallon of weak ale a day, not for fun, but as liquid bread for a body burning thousands of calories. Brewing was women's work. Oats, meanwhile, ruled in the cool, damp climates of Scotland, Ireland, and Scandinavia. The 16th century historian Hector Beese wrote that Scots lived on cakes of oats and pottage of oats with a little mixture of peas or beans. Archaeological sites confirm this, with oat remains and processing tools everywhere. Oats made terrible bread but perfect porridge and oat cakes. Flat, portable cakes of oatmeal, water, and salt, ideal for field workers. Millet was the underdog, thriving in Central and Eastern Europe where other grains faltered. It grew in just 60 to 90 days, needed little water, and could handle poor soil. In Poland, Hungary, and parts of France and Italy, millet was turned into porridge or flat cakes, or even fermented into a kvass-like drink. Elites like 12th century writer Alexander Neckham might have called barley bread horse fodder. But these grains were nutritional powerhouses, rich in protein, fiber, and micronutrients. When wheat failed, as during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, archaeological evidence shows a spike in barley and oat use, even in wheat-heavy regions. Manuals like Pietro de Crescenzi's advised mixing millet with wheat to stretch supplies, noting it nourishes little but fills the belly. That's the peasant way, making do, finding a way to survive. Now let's step from the fields into the garden, where roots were growing beneath the soil, ready to carry peasants through the leanest months. Turnips, carrots, parsnips. These weren't glamorous, but they were the backbone of survival. Turnips were the champions, grown across northern Europe and showing up in archaeological digs as seeds and pollen. They were easy to cultivate, yielded well in poor soil, and could be planted after the grain harvest, giving families a second crop. A 13th century treatise by Walter of Henley praised turnips as food for both humans and animals, sustaining households through winter. These weren't the neat, purple-topped turnips of today. Medieval ones were bigger, whiter, and often bitter, boiled or roasted into pottage. In desperate times, they were dried and ground into flour to stretch grain supplies. Carrots and parsnips were just as vital. Medieval carrots were purple, yellow, or white, thinner and woodier than ours, with a stronger flavor. Parsnips, sweeter after frost, were prized in northern regions for their calories. Archaeological sites in England, Germany, and Scandinavia show parsnip seeds in household waste, proof of their widespread use. These roots were stored in cellars, cool, humid pits lined with straw, or in outdoor clamps, mounds covered with soil for insulation. At Warham Percy, archaeologists found a cellar with turnips and parsnips preserved this way, a glimpse of medieval ingenuity. These crops were rich in vitamin C, fighting scurvy in winter when fresh produce was gone, and their fiber aided digestion of coarse bread. Manorial records note thefts of stored roots during the spring hunger gap, when winter stores ran low and new crops weren't ready, showing just how precious they were. As the seasons turned, the garden offered more than roots. Let's linger here and explore the leafy greens that brought color and health to the peasant table. Cabbage and kale were the stars, grown across Europe and found in archaeological digs from England to Poland. Medieval cabbage wasn't the tight heads we know. It was looser, leafier, like collards, letting gardeners harvest leaves over months without killing the plant. Place names like coal fields, from the Germanic word for cabbage, show its deep roots in daily life. It was boiled, added to pottage, or fermented into early sauerkraut, especially in Germany and Scandinavia, where digs uncover crocks used for fermentation. Kale, a cold-weather warrior, kept producing leaves through frost, making it a winter lifeline. Sites like West Stow in Suffolk show brassica seeds in huge quantities, proof these were staples. Other greens like spinach, beet greens, and arach added variety in summer, though they didn't store well. These plants were nutritional heavyweights, with heritage varieties packing more vitamins than modern ones. They fought scurvy, aided digestion, and made pottage taste better. In literature like Piers Plowman, cabbage was a symbol of peasant life, humble but essential. As we wander through the garden, we can't ignore the pungent plants that added flavor and healing to these meals. Onions, leeks, and garlic were the secret weapons of peasant cooking, transforming bland dishes and doubling as medicine. Archaeological digs at Warham Percy uncover onion skins and carbonized remains in storage areas, showing they were grown and kept in bulk. Smaller and sharper than today's varieties, onions were dried or hung in strings, lasting through winter, and chopped into pottage for depth. Leeks, especially in Wales and northern Europe, stayed in the ground through mild winters, providing fresh greens when little else was available. At Coppergate in York, leek seeds in garden plots confirm their role in modest households. Garlic, with its antimicrobial powers, was a medicinal staple, recommended in texts like the Salernitan Regimen of Health for everything from colds to parasites. Alliums were easy to grow, needing little care, and their bulbs ensured self-sufficiency. They were practical and magical. Garlic warded off evil in folklore, while onions predicted weather. These plants turned survival foods into meals worth eating. Beyond flavor, the garden offered protein in the form of legumes, peas, broad beans, lentils. These were the heavyweights that kept peasants going when meat was a dream. Dried peas ruled in northern Europe, with archaeological sites like Warham Percy littered with their remains. Smaller and tougher than modern peas, they were dried for year-round use, providing protein and calories. Broad beans, or fava beans, were huge in Central and Southern Europe, their seeds found in storage areas at sites like Dracy in Burgundy. Lentils, quick cooking and nutrient-dense, were a Mediterranean favorite that spread north. Legumes also improved soil fertility, rotated with grains to boost yields, as advised by 13th-century writers like Walter of Henley. Peas pottage, a thick soup with onions and herbs, was so iconic it inspired nursery rhymes like peas porridge hot. During Lent, when meat was banned, legumes were the go-to protein. Nutritionally, they were a game-changer, offering 8 to 10 grams of protein per serving, plus fiber and B vitamins. Combined with grains, they formed complete proteins, a trick peasants learned through experience. Let's step from the garden to the barnyard, where animal products, milk, cheese, eggs, and fish added rare but vital nutrition. Dairy was a treat, not a staple. Manorial records show 30 to 40% of peasants owned a cow, but goats were more common, needing less pasture. Milk flowed in spring and summer but dried up in winter, so it was turned into cheese or butter for storage. At Warren Percy, cheese molds with holes for draining whey show household production of simple, fresh cheeses like cottage cheese. Butter, salted or clarified, was used sparingly as a fat source. Eggs were a godsend, thanks to chickens that needed little space or feed. Eggshell fragments appear in nearly every peasant home, and manorial records list eggs as rent payments. Medieval hens laid just 60 to 80 eggs a year, but they were boiled, fried, or preserved in lime or brine. Fish, especially preserved herring, was key during Lent and for coastal communities. Even inland sites like Warren Percy show fish bones, proof of a trade in salted or dried fish. These animal products provided protein, fats, and vitamins A and D, rounding out a plant-heavy diet. They were often paid as rent or bartered, making them currency as much as food. Now, let's leave the village and venture into the wild, where foraged foods, greens, berries, nuts, and mushrooms added variety and survival insurance. Nettles were a superstar, packed with iron, calcium, and vitamins, found in cooking contexts at sites like West Cotton. Boiled to neutralize their sting, they were added to pottage. Fat hen, dandelions, and sorrel were other favorites, their seeds and pollen in cesspits across Europe. Berries like blackberries and elderberries brought sweetness in summer, some dried or fermented for winter. Hazelnuts, walnuts, and chestnuts were calorie-dense prizes, with nutshells and even nutcrackers found at Warren Percy. Mushrooms, though harder to trace, were vital in woodland regions, with tools and residues hinting at their use. This wild pantry required deep ecological knowledge, passed down through generations, to avoid toxic plants. Finally, let's raise a cup to the drinks that kept peasants hydrated and nourished: ale, water, herbal infusions, and more. Ale was king in Northern Europe, safer than water and packed with 400 to 500 calories per quart. Archaeological sites show brewing equipment in peasant homes, with women called alewives turning barley into a drink sipped all day. Water wasn't avoided. Wells at Warren Percy show investment in clean sources. Herbal infusions, made from mint or chamomile, doubled as medicine, with residues in ceramic vessels. Fruit juices and lightly fermented ciders added flavor in summer, while whey from cheesemaking was a protein-rich drink. This medieval diet was a triumph of ingenuity. Whole grains, legumes, wild foods, and occasional animal products created a sustainable system that supported hard labor and survived famines. Archaeological evidence shows healthy adults despite tough conditions, thanks to preservation techniques like fermentation and drying. This diet's low ecological footprint, local, low waste, integrated with nature, offers lessons for today. So, wild ones, next time you eat lentil soup or whole grain bread, think of those peasants, thriving within limits. What surprised you most about their diet? Drop it in the comments, like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories from the human wild. Thanks for joining us. Sometimes the wisest way forward is to look back.